Hello, my dear masterminds. They were the quiet ones, not the loud critics, not the obvious challengers. The ones who watched closely never rushed to conclusions. They observed patterns, tracked timing, measured responses. They thought patience would give them clarity. They believed distance would make the picture sharper. At first, they felt confident in their assumptions. They labeled your calm as calculation, your restraint as hesitation, your silence as waiting. From their perspective, nothing about you demanded urgency. You didn't force attention. You didn't disrupt the surface. You let moments pass without reacting, and to an observer, that looked predictable. That's what made them comfortable. They assumed understanding was only a matter of time, that if they watched long enough, the pattern would resolve into something familiar. What they didn't account for is that observation only works when the subject is operating within the observer's frame. You weren't. You weren't adapting to being watched. You weren't adjusting behavior based on who was paying attention. You moved from internal timing, not external pressure, and internal timing doesn't accelerate for scrutiny. The ones who watched closely began noticing something that didn't fit their models. Your responses didn't correlate with incentives. Your decisions didn't change when outcomes shifted. Pressure didn't compress you. Silence didn't draw you out. The longer they observed, the more the expected variables failed to connect. That's when the discomfort started. Not confusion, discomfort. Because confusion can be resolved with more data. Discomfort signals a flaw in the assumption itself. They realized they weren't missing information. They were using the wrong lens. And once that realization begins, it doesn't stop quietly. They tried to refine that lens instead of replacing it. That's what careful observers do when something doesn't add up. They slow down. They isolate moments. They look for micro-reactions, a shift in tone, a tell in timing, something small that proves the structure still applies. But nothing surfaced. You didn't tighten under scrutiny. You didn't loosen when attention faded. Your behavior didn't bend toward approval or away from consequence. It stayed aligned to something they couldn't see, but could sense. That's when doubt crept in. Not about you, but about their own reading. Because the ones who watch closely rely on confirmation. They trust that if someone is observed long enough, the truth will surface. With you, nothing surfaced because nothing was being held back. You weren't concealing intent. You weren't managing perception. You weren't waiting to reveal anything. You were already operating from a completed position. And completed positions don't resolve into clearer explanations over time. They remain stable. That stability weakened their confidence. They started questioning earlier conclusions, replaying moments they thought they understood, noticing how often they'd filled gaps with interpretation instead of evidence. They saw how they'd mistaken restraint for strategy, silence for calculation, patience for delay. The closer they looked, the more obvious it became that their assumptions weren't evolving toward clarity. They were losing coherence. And once observers realized their certainty was built on projection, watching becomes uncomfortable. Because now they aren't studying you, they're studying the limits of their own understanding. That shift changed how they watched you. Observation turned inward. They stopped asking what you were doing and started asking why their interpretations kept failing. They noticed that every framework they applied assumed you were responding to something outside yourself. Status, pressure, expectation, reward. None of those variables moved you. You didn't become more animated when opportunity appeared. You didn't contract when risks surfaced. You didn't accelerate to prove relevance, or slow down to avoid consequence. That constancy wasn't indifference. It was alignment. And alignment without reference to the observer removes the observer's advantage. The ones who watched closely realized something uncomfortable. You weren't being subtle. You were being exact. Exactness doesn't perform. It doesn't exaggerate or minimize. It simply holds. They understood then why time hadn't clarified anything. Time only reveals what is in motion. You weren't in motion relative to their expectations. You were moving according to an internal sequence that didn't sync with their clock. That's why watching longer didn't help. It only made the mismatch more obvious. Their assumptions had relied on the idea that everyone eventually responds to the same pressures. You didn't, and that meant their certainty wasn't just incomplete. It was miscalibrated from the start. The moment they accepted that, observation stopped being a tool. It became a reminder. Some people don't reveal themselves by being watched. They reveal the limits of watching itself. That realization forced a recalibration they didn't expect to make. The ones who watched closely had always trusted their patience. They believed distance created objectivity. But objectivity assumes the subject exists inside a readable structure. You didn't. And once they saw that, watching lost its advantage, because observation without influence becomes self-exposure. Not of you, of the observer. They noticed how often their interpretations had depended on familiarity rather than accuracy. You never did. Your consistency wasn't the result of discipline or control. It was the absence of fragmentation. You weren't managing versions of yourself for different contexts. You weren't adjusting tone to maintain position. You weren't performing stability. You were stable. And stability that doesn't react to scrutiny quietly removes the need for interpretation. That's when they stopped narrating your behavior and started accounting for it, not trying to predict you, not trying to decode you, simply acknowledging that whatever governed you wasn't accessible through watching alone. Their assumptions didn't vanish all at once. They thinned gradually, until they no longer carried confidence. The ones who watched closely didn't arrive at a dramatic conclusion. They arrived at restraint. They understood that insight wasn't something they could earn through attention. It required alignment. They didn't possess. And once that becomes clear, observation ends naturally. Not because curiosity is satisfied, but because it no longer applies. What replaced that observation wasn't certainty. It was restraint without announcement. They didn't say they were wrong. They simply stopped insisting they were right. The ones who watched closely began treating your presence as something to account for rather than interpret. They stopped waiting for a reveal that never came. They noticed that nothing about you sharpened under scrutiny or softened with neglect. Attention didn't amplify you. Absence didn't reduce you. And that consistency led them somewhere they hadn't expected. You weren't operating in response to the environment. You were operating independent of it. That independence invalidated their assumptions, because assumptions rely on reciprocity. They rely on reaction. You gave none, so the framework they were using lost relevance. Quietly, without confrontation, the watchers adjusted by becoming less intrusive, less certain, less eager to explain you to others. Because explaining would have required confidence they no longer trusted. They learned that some forms of understanding don't come from proximity or patience. They come from recognizing when a lens no longer applies, and once that recognition settles, the most accurate response is restraint. The ones who watched closely adjusted their thinking not because you changed, but because their certainty shifted. You remained exactly as you were, and that steadiness made the difference visible. That shift didn't arrive instantly. It settled gradually, the way genuine understanding often does. They stopped trying to predict your next move because prediction kept missing. They stopped narrating your intent because narration kept unraveling. What they noticed instead was how little effort you spent managing perception. You weren't signaling. You weren't correcting misunderstandings. You weren't leaning into or away from the roles others projected onto you. You let those projections exist until they ran out of energy. And projections always do when they aren't reinforced. The ones who watched closely understood something most people overlook. You weren't withholding information to stay hidden. You simply didn't organize yourself around being seen. That's why observation never translated into influence. Attention didn't shift you. Analysis didn't narrow you. Time didn't simplify you. And that's when they recognized the error they'd made early on. You let those projections exist until they ran out of energy. And projections always do when they aren't reinforced. The ones who watched closely understood something most people overlook. You weren't withholding information to stay hidden. You simply didn't organize yourself around being seen. That's why observation never translated into influence. Attention didn't shift you. Analysis didn't narrow you. Time didn't simplify you. And that's when they recognized the error they'd made early on. That acceptance is where it settles for them, even if they never articulate it. The ones who watched closely stopped circling, stopped measuring, stop waiting for a moment where you finally align with expectation. They understand now that alignment was never missing. You weren't delayed. You weren't subtle. You weren't waiting to reveal anything. You were moving according to an internal order that didn't respond to observation. Once that becomes clear, watching turns into interference rather than insight. So they pull back. Not because they're defeated, but because accuracy requires it. They account for you instead of analyzing you. They stop assuming access where none was ever offered. They let go of the idea that attention grants understanding. That shift holds. You didn't change their thinking by explaining yourself. You changed their behavior by never needing to. The ones who watched closely reconsider their assumptions because those assumptions no longer hold under reflection. You remained consistent. Their certainty did not. And in that difference, clarity settled without resistance, quietly, fully. What ends after that is the habit of assumption itself. They don't just rethink what they believed about you. They rethink how quickly they believe they understand anyone at all. The ones who watched closely learn restraint through experience. They stopped treating observation as authority. They stopped mistaking patience for access. They realized that attention does not equal insight, and proximity does not equal permission. You didn't block their view. You revealed that the view was never the path to understanding. From then on, they pause before labeling silence as calculation, calm as delay, restraint as strategy, because they remember how confident they once felt watching you, and how inaccurate that confidence proved to be. You didn't become clearer over time. You stayed the same. It was their certainty that wore thin. And that change doesn't rewind. They move differently now. Speak with less assumption. Watch without believing control. Comes with attention. You didn't correct their conclusions. You simply never adjusted to their gaze. The ones who watched closely reconsider their assumptions because they learned something that stays learned. Some people are not revealed through observation. They reveal the limits of observation itself. And once that limit is reached, It doesn't require revisiting. This is where it settles without reopening. The ones who watched closely don't turn into critics or followers. They become aware of a line they hadn't noticed before. They understand now that attention isn't influence when it doesn't change what it observes. And certainty isn't earned through patience when the subject isn't oriented toward the observer. You didn't escape their understanding. You made it unnecessary. They stopped trying to explain you to others because explanation would require confidence they no longer trust. They stopped filling silence with interpretation because they remember how inaccurate that felt. What remains is clarity, not about who you are, but about how limited watching actually is. You stayed aligned internally and unmoved by scrutiny. Their assumptions faded because they were never grounded to begin with. Once that realization settles, it doesn't drift away. They don't circle back. They don't retry with better tools. They accept the limit and adjust accordingly. The ones who watched closely reconsider their assumptions, not because you changed, but because their way of seeing reached its edge. You didn't confront them. You didn't clarify anything. You simply remained consistent long enough for certainty to give way on its own. And that kind of ending doesn't need explanation. What they carry forward isn't curiosity anymore. It's restraint that arrives before thought. The ones who watched closely no longer rush to interpret silence or decode calm. They remember how attention failed to bring clarity, how patience didn't unlock insight, how certainty weakened the longer you remained unchanged. That memory reshapes how they move through other situations as well. They observe with less urgency. They assume with more care. They understand now that observation only holds influence when the subject responds to it. You never did. And because of that, watching you taught them more about the limits of their own certainty than about you. You didn't demand respect. You didn't ask to be understood. You didn't correct a single assumption. You allowed those assumptions to stand until they lost coherence. And once people experience that, they don't forget it. They adjust naturally. The ones who watched closely reconsider their assumptions because they learn something that doesn't need reinforcement. Some people aren't revealed by scrutiny. They reveal where scrutiny stops working. And once that point is reached, the accurate response is restraint. The final shift they never announce happens internally. They don't talk about it. They don't frame it as a lesson. They simply stop overestimating their ability to read people through observation alone. The ones who watched closely learn that some individuals don't reveal truth under attention because their truth isn't reactive. It isn't assembled in response to pressure. It's already formed. You didn't close yourself off. You didn't become opaque. You stayed exactly as you were, and that steadiness revealed how much certainty often depends on others shifting when watched. From then on, they approach moments with less assumption and more precision. They listen longer. They pause sooner. They recognize that not every calm is delay, not every silence is strategy, and not every restraint is waiting to be decoded. You didn't defeat their assumptions. You outlasted them. And outlasting doesn't invite debate. It produces adjustment. Quiet, durable, automatic. The ones who watched closely reconsider their assumptions because they came up against something that didn't respond to being seen. And once that happens, watching becomes observation only, nothing more. This is where movement stops for them. No more interpretation. No more internal narration. No quiet plans to understand it later. The moment settles, and it stays settled. They realize now that you weren't withholding clarity. You simply weren't participating in the exchange that produces it. Their assumptions didn't fail because they were careless. They failed because they were built on a rule that doesn't apply to you. The rule that watching creates access. It doesn't. Not when someone's center is internal. Not when behavior isn't shaped by reaction. You didn't exceed their expectations. You made the framework that produced them unusable. And frameworks like that aren't repaired. They're set aside. So this is the end state. The ones who watched closely don't return to the question. They don't test from another angle. They already understand what won't work. And knowing that is enough. You didn't become more visible. You became settled. And settled presence removes the need for conclusions. They reconsidered their assumptions because those assumptions reached a limit they couldn't move past. You didn't push them there. You simply didn't move, and that stillness did the rest. What settles last is quiet recognition. They stopped trying to name you. Labels belong to an earlier habit, a way to feel finished with something they never fully understood. That habit ends here. What replaces it is restraint that arrives before thought. They sense a limit without seeing it marked. They recognize a line without it being enforced. Not because you warned them, but because experience already did. You didn't assert authority. You demonstrated independence from it. And that demonstration doesn't invite discussion. It resolves the dynamic. The ones who watched closely understand now that some people aren't meant to be interpreted. They're meant to be accounted for. You don't get folded into narratives. You become a reference others orient around without comment. That's why they stop watching the way they used to. Not out of fear, out of accuracy. They know attention won't move you. Pressure won't reveal you. Time won't soften you into explanation. You were never hiding anything. You were already complete before they arrived. And completeness ends the need for conclusions. This is where it finishes. Quiet, clean, settled.